It started.
Okay, very good. Welcome back, everybody. Our last presentation of the day, but certainly an interesting topic about urban areas. Michael Commons from the U.S. Census Bureau will be giving our final presentation of the day. So thank you, Michael.
All right. Thank you, Lynn. Thanks, Barb. Thank you all for participating and joining and listening to everything I have to share. And I'll start off with I've been a member of the urban areas delineation team for about 4.5 years. But I wanted to mention that my very first presentation on urban areas, solo presentation, was at the New Jersey State Data Center meeting. I think it was the summer of 2018 at Rutgers. So it's kind of nice to come all the way back around and then back here we're almost finished
Yep.
with all of this. So it's been quite an experience. So with that, what I'm going to share today is the criteria that we're using to delineate urban areas for the 2020 census. However, it'll be a little bit complicated because for those of you that are aware or kind of following this process, in February of this year, we published the Federal Register notice with the proposed criteria for the 2020 census. And since that time, we have given probably the team and I have given probably 20 or so presentations similar to this. Received a lot of feedback. We've conducted workshops, the public comment period from the Federal Register notice itself, taking all of that in, digesting it, conducting a lot of thorough analysis, and making significant improvements to the criteria since that published Federal Register notice. So what I'm going to do is I will actually present first very quickly what is included in that proposed Federal Register notice criteria. And then I'll go into the changes that we have made since then. So I apologize that it's sort of multiple levels, but I hope that provides the proper context and understanding for like how we've gotten to where we are now. So really quickly, this is a synopsis of the main changes that we have made again, this is from the perspective of the February of this year Federal Register notice, the changes that we have made since 2010. So we conduct this delineation after every decennial census. So it's only every 10 years. And the last time that we conducted it was 2010. These are the major changes that we were proposing to the criteria from the perspective of 2010. So we were looking to increase the minimum threshold to qualify as an urban area. It used to be 2,500 persons. We are looking at using 10,000 persons or 4,000 housing units. So it's an either or. We will stop distinguishing between different types of urban areas. So we used to identify or at least distinguish the difference where any urban area with a population of 50,000 or more was considered an urbanized area. Anything with a population less than 50,000 but greater than 2,500 was an urban cluster. We are no longer distinguishing between those two. We feel that that distinction is something that should be implemented by whoever is utilizing our data. We typically, the delineation process at this point is identical regardless of the total population size. Historically, that difference existed because we used to delineate differently, but that's long past. So while we're not going to distinguish between them, we will of course publish all of the population data. So any programmatic needs or any data user that wants to identify similar types in terms of population size, similar types of urban areas as those in 2010 and prior, they can just identify all of those that have a population greater than 50,000 or whatever threshold they feel is appropriate. The next is the adoption of housing unit density instead of for qualification of individual census blocks. In the past, for quite a few decades, we have been using population density. We have decided to transition over to housing unit density. I'll explain why shortly, but that is a significant change. Then also reducing the maximum distance of jumps. We in 2000 jumps were 1.5 miles, but then in 2010 sorry, in 2000 we extended them to 2.5 miles. In 2010 we continued using 2.5 miles, but we also incorporated the National Land Cover Database with impervious surfaces. And I'll describe that in more detail, but that combination, that combination of data inputs really caused a lot of our urban areas to be overextended, overbounded, and joining up in areas where they should not necessarily. So we've pulled that back, reduced it to 1.5 miles. The hop distance has stayed consistent at 0.5 miles. Along those lines, we are no longer including the low density hop or jump corridor. So where we did have the main core of an urban area and then we were hopping or jumping out to another area, we used to include the blocks that were along that corridor. No longer are we. So as a result, the urban areas will potentially, many of them will be non-contiguous. So there will be multiple parts to them. Then lastly, for the splitting of large agglomerations, which New Jersey is obviously right in the middle of a really massive urban agglomeration. The splitting, we are now introducing and utilizing the LEHD data, loads data specifically. These are data that the U.S. Census Bureau collects and really creates. They are gathered from state unemployment records and then associated with the employer address, and then we connect it to the resident address. So these data are actually network data that identify home block and employment block. And so and I'll go into more detail on that, but we're utilizing those data to have as much of a data-driven objective splitting approach. So these are basically the same kind of changes that I was just describing, and I wanted to just highlight the reason I kept this slide in. This is kind of a merging of many different presentations, but these two items, the no longer distinguishing between urban area types and reducing the maximum distance of jumps, those criteria we have held constant. We are not even considering changing that. The feedback that we received both in workshops and then from the official comment period of Federal Register notice, we've received very little input on this that really supported the idea of bringing those criteria back in. So again, those we were not considering, but all of these others we have considered some additional changes and improvements, among others, and I will detail those. So again, these are just the same things. I left these slides in for people that are really interested and they want to review, but much of this I already described. So increasing the minimum threshold to qualify as an urban area to 10,000 persons or 4,000, no longer distinguishing between the two. Reducing that maximum distance of the jumps. As I mentioned, it was extended in 2000 to 2.5. The impervious surface combined with that criteria to really overbound. Excluding the territory that the excluded territory that extends hops and jumps. This is water, either from the census block definition, so we do have water blocks, and then also the National Land Cover Database wetland and water classification. Those are being held constant as well. No longer including the corridors. So this is an example on the right side of this map is like the main core of the urban area. This is new development that has been created, has urban characteristics. They are not contiguous, but they are within that hop or jump distance. And so while in the past we would have included these yellow blocks that are really non-urban in character, we are no longer keeping those. So instead we will have two separate pieces or multiple pieces of an urban area, although they are still all classified as one. The switch from population density to housing unit density, there have been numerous reasons for that. For one, these are kind of listed on the right, it's what we feel is a more direct measure of the developed landscape. So there are many cases where housing units are not occupied on census day, April 1st. So our population counts are based on where everyone resides or is on April 1st, essentially. But there are certain parts of our country that have extensive amounts of development, housing units, where no one really resides year-round. So imagine beach towns, ski resorts, areas like this. We have blocks with hundreds and hundreds of housing units, but very low population. So in this case, by using the housing unit count and converting it to density, we really are describing the structure on the landscape as opposed to where people were on a single given day. Secondly, that also creates the potential for redelineating between censuses. So because in the past we were using population at the block level, that is only collected one time every 10 years during the decennial census. We are constantly updating our address list and our housing unit counts. And so because we are relying primarily on housing unit density instead of population, we do have the potential to update more frequently than every 10 years. Some parts of the country that's more important than others, where development is occurring very rapidly. And then lastly, and this is really, while we on the team really agreed that these first two issues were important and relevant and could improve the model, this last point is what kicked us over and really made sure that we made this switch. Probably many of you are familiar with the disclosure avoidance methodology that's being used, and that population counts at the block level are variant. So there are measures being taken that would alter the number of people in a given block. When you're dealing with densities, population density, for example, just a few people in or out of the block can affect that density significantly. Alternatively, and so what we have chosen is to use housing unit density, which is invariant. There are no disclosure avoidance disclosure avoidance methodologies being implemented on housing units. So they are invariant. We can be very confident in that number and the density, and have a much more structured model as a result. Now, over on the left side, probably you've all been reading while I was talking, but the density that we were proposing in the Federal Register notice was 385 housing units. That's approximately equivalent to the 1,000 persons per square mile, which was one of the two thresholds used in 2010. This is just using an equivalent of, this is equal to one housing unit per 1.6 acres, but this was implementing the ACS average persons per household, which is 2.6. So that's how we got from 1,000 to 385. That was the nationwide average. But a lot, so that's basically, that was all of the criteria that was in the proposed Federal Register notice. But with the feedback that we received from everyone, which was really awesome, and through the comments and through workshops, we wanted to improve a few things. One of them was how accessible these types of densities are to the public. When you hear something like 385 housing units per square mile, who can really, I certainly can't, but I'm wondering who can actually conceive of that on the landscape. As you're walking around, can you say like, oh, this block is clearly 400 housing units per square mile? These are not accessible numbers really. And so what I did is I just created this table with basically translations of other types of measures that are, I think, more accessible. And the one that I like the most that I can kind of conceive and in my imagination is the acreage per housing unit. So for example, that 385 housing units is approximately 1.7 acres per housing unit. So pretty large lot. But this also allowed us to consider other densities and what we really think of as urban. And so I don't have a slide for it, but the densities that we will be looking at are the half-acre lot, so 1,280 housing units per square mile, 1.5 acre lot, which is 427 housing units per square mile, and then lastly, 3-acre lots at 213 housing units per square mile. But hopefully this table kind of helps kind of gain an idea and a firm grasp on what these densities truly mean. Also, I should have said earlier on, but maybe it was throughout all the presentations. If you have a question, feel free to interrupt me. That's fine. You can put it in the chat or ask your question verbally. So in thinking about these densities, we wanted to go back and look what was the composition of the urban areas in terms of block level housing units per square mile in 2010. So what I did here is just graph them out really quickly of all of the urban areas in 2010, those with a population of at least 1 million, which there were 42 of. This is the composition of housing units, block level housing units for each urban area, ordered by size, the population size. So you can see a couple that jump out really quickly. Well, many that have the majority. So, and then I'll point this out too. Sorry, the density legend is at the bottom. So the darkest colors are actually the lowest densities. So this dark green at the bottom is less than 213. Those are three acre lots. That's really spread out, low density. And then these 4 classes. So what we can see that jump out really quickly, a lot of those that have most of the population within these high density areas are on the West Coast, California specifically, such as Los Angeles, where you have about 95% of the population residing in really high density, well, we consider for our definition, high density blocks. Alternatively, you can look at Atlanta that jumps out really quickly. You can see that only, about 50%, the graph is cut here, it doesn't go to 100, but about 50% of the population resides in that top density class. But you can see a lot of it is really in this this next one, 427 to 1280. This is a really suburban, what people would perceive as suburban type urban area. So this was just one method of kind of getting an idea of taking the data and what we know about cities and these urban areas, how they were delineated, and getting a really good understanding of the composition of each. Now, these are the same data, but I adjusted the graph to reach 100 so that you can compare, for example. So these are the median 42 in terms of population. And this one that jumps out right in the middle, and it just happened to be, but it has become one of our case studies, is Archer Lodge, North Carolina. And in this case, you can see only about 5% of the total population is in that highest category, and about almost 65, over 65, almost 70% of the population is less than 427 housing units per square mile, very low density. And I will show some maps to demonstrate what that really looks like. Moving down the population order, these are using some other thresholds, but these are kind of the smaller in terms of population urban areas. While many of them do have high proportions of low density, there are still quite a few with very high density overall. And then lastly, the very lowest population. So again, feel free to peruse these slides. I presume that they will be shared with you. So now, where are we? We've taken all of that and we've moved forward. And so with that feedback, we have identified the 3 different densities that we would be using. But these 2 of them are listed here. It's really the idea, this kind of conceptual idea of ensuring that there is some sort of a high density core within every urban area, that hops and jumps occur in moderately dense areas to ensure that there's a strong rationale for making those hop and jump connections. And then lastly, acknowledging that there still needs to be some sort of a low density fill to kind of to fill out a lot of the areas. We're using this final fill low density. Furthermore, we found, and I'll show examples of almost all of these, but we also noticed that in the preliminary results, we had what we call cycles. The cycles are just individual, independent groups of contiguous blocks. So a single urban area may have multiple cycles where hops are occurring. In the proposed criteria, we had no limit, no minimum number of housing units per cycle. It went all the way down to 1, and that was a problem. So at the end of it, we want to make sure that no discontiguous individual cycle has fewer than 50 housing units. We don't want, these kind of strange satellite blocks hanging out with only a few housing units. And then lastly, and this is something that we received a lot of comments on, pulling that minimum threshold back down and allowing, and so it's down to 5,000 persons or 2,000 housing units. So it still is double the population from what 2010 was, but it's half of the population minimum from the proposed criteria. And I see a long comment. I'll read that shortly. It looks like really good stuff, but I'll come back to it if that's all right. So I'll show a few examples. I mentioned that we felt that an urban area really needs to have some sort of a high density core, especially if we are going to drop that minimum population or housing unit count down to 5,000 or 2,000 housing units. We wanted to make sure that we're not capturing kind of low density satellite areas that really are not urban in character. And so I try not to read the comments. So by reducing it back down, it really supports even further the idea that it needs to have a high density core. Now, I'll show 2 examples here. This Oxford, North Carolina is, it's still much higher than this minimum, but it's a pretty good example of a small, in terms of population, urban area. And I just have a few metrics on here, such as the total housing unit per area is 575. So it's kind of an overall density and the total size. Now, what the place that I had mentioned earlier in the table data, Archer Lodge, Clayton, North Carolina, its population in 2010 was 13,000, but you can see that the total housing unit density is 230. Also, and what's really significant and the point here is that just looking at the imagery, you can see that there's no real central urban core, urban center, downtown, however you want to describe it, but there's no centrality to this area. These are primarily just very large housing developments. So they have concentration of houses, but there's no like center. We feel that these types of areas should be included as urban areas, but maybe not as their own. So Archer Lodge, while it maybe does have urban characteristics, at least suburban, which we really capture within our urban definition, it's not necessarily strong enough in a sense of an urban area to stand alone. And so we've come up with an approach for making sure that these types of areas still could be included. But I really want to reemphasize this comparison of these 2 areas and just the visual difference where you have the downtown versus really not having anything. So the high density cores, they're relying on this much higher density of 1,280 housing units per square mile. This is actually still a relatively low density for those that are really familiar with these. If you look at somewhere like Los Angeles, like 95% of the urban area is at or in excess of this density. But in this map here, you can see what that core would look like. If I go back up to here, there's Oxford, but then this is our new delineation and the actual core that is there. And maybe some of you had the opportunity to look at we created an online viewer for the proposed criteria. And one of the things that stood out really clearly when you go in and observe these are all of these tiny little cycles, as I mentioned, these small blocks, low housing units, discontiguous, and it looks like just a scatter of urbanity. And we knew that was a problem, and so we just had to figure out how we were going to resolve it. We were using the final fill technique. So wherever these exist, so we delineate, we're still hopping and jumping to cores, to these cycles, but then once all that is finished, we fill in any area that is contiguous and has at least 213 housing units per square mile. What that looks like, it fills in all of these gaps, connects them all together, connects them to the main core. Those that are left still outside, if they have fewer than 50 housing units, then they would be removed. They would no longer qualify. So a few of these will drop out, but we were able to capture most of them. Looking at them a little bit closer and with the imagery really demonstrates what's going on in many of these cases. While this is not always true, there are many cases where you have the internal part of a housing development qualify because it's bounded quite tightly by roads, therefore a block can be formed. And so it has quite high density, but then the blocks that are just next to it, adjacent, clearly a part of the same landscape, part of the same development, there's no difference in character. They were not qualifying because those blocks contain all of that rural area on the outside. And so this was, these are things that we just could not accept in our model. And so the way that we resolve that is using that final fill again. One of the other pieces, the criterion that we were hoping to get more feedback on, but unfortunately we didn't really. In the proposed criteria, we were accepting any block that was contiguous and contained a group quarter, regardless of the population of that group quarter. And so what we kind of knew it was going to happen. We didn't know the extent to it. There are many extremely large blocks with just one or two group quarters with very low populations. And so many of them were pulled into the delineation that we shared online and it was described in the Federal Register notice. So for example, in this Silverthorne, Frisco, Colorado and Breckenridge, Colorado, they were two separate urban areas in 2010. They joined up in our test delineation because of these massive group quarter blocks. This is a ski resort. Oftentimes, what I observed are, in these more mountainous areas, the large GQ blocks, I'm presuming, are like dormitories or something for the folks that are working there. So what we have done is a pretty simple fix. We don't necessarily love it. We were expecting a lot more feedback and some comments, maybe some experts, subject matter experts on group quarters, but we didn't get any. So we just created our own solution. And what we're doing, it's not what we love because it's still dependent on population, but any group quarter block that is contiguous with other qualifying areas that has a population density of 500 people per square mile will qualify. So the only difference from the proposed criteria is that the group quarter block must also have a total population density of 500. And then also, since the Federal Register notice went out, we were very pleased to see that the U.S. Geological Survey did release the newest National Land Cover Database. It's 2019 data. And so we have that for both our impervious surface and for our wetlands and water classification. Unfortunately, that has not been updated for areas outside of the continental U.S., so we unfortunately have to rely on older data, but it still exists. Now, what I want to do is, that was a lot of kind of changes and things. I'm going to show a very simplified, non-to-scale model just to reiterate this process and kind of our logic and rationale behind it. So I created this very kind of elementary visualization, but it'll progress through as the urban area develops. Using these color codes, so I have what's called the primary core, and also what I'll note, and I'll apologize for, is that these density measures are actually a little bit different. These are what we will very likely use. All of the research I was doing earlier were using those odd numbers, while they like 400, 427 and 1280. They translated to housing unit or acres per housing units, but we prefer rounded numbers. So that's the only difference there. They're very close. But so you have the primary core, it's that high density core that is necessary within an urban area. Then we have the secondary core. This is really what they're built on. Then what I'm calling in this model, at least, is the hop and jump cores. In these cases, they use the same density criteria as the secondary core, but they must have at least 10 housing units. So for any area to be hopped or jumped to, it has to have at least 10 housing units. And then lastly, that final fill. Oh, and truly lastly, the non-residential urban territory. Currently in the FR, it only mentions impervious surface blocks that are within a quarter mile of any existing urban area. We are also looking at including blocks that have at least 1,000 employment terminuses, jobs in a sense, from the loads data. And then the types of connections that can occur or types of merges and splits. So we start by identifying that primary core, the high density. The numbers that are inside of each of these squares as we progress would be an approximate housing unit count. So we have the primary core, high density, about 5,000 housing units. Then we develop the secondary cores. These are that kind of middle density. And they grow out. They need to have at least 500 housing units to exist. Then we start hopping out and creating all of these kind of webs or networks. Collections of cycles or cores that have at least 10 housing units each. Then we run the jumps, essentially the same process, except using, it's a greater distance. And I will imply here that the excluded territory is also included. So the hops and jumps can be extended if they are hopping or jumping over water or wetlands. And then the final fill. So this is to like connect all of those kind of non-contiguous separate cycles, bring them together into a more kind of clean looking and truly logically urban landscape. And then we find, and so in cases where they merge together, these would all become one. This would be one urban area, and this would be one separate because they are disconnected. Now, as I mentioned before, we have that kind of final limitation. If any of the individual cycles have fewer than 50 housing units, then they would not be included. So in this case, these two are removed. And then also any of these cores that develop, if nowhere within their web kind of network, if nowhere within that is a primary core, then it also will not qualify. And so you would end up with this kind of being the final qualifying urban area. Obviously not to scale, so don't keep that in mind. This is not really what they look like, but it's conceptually how it functions. Now I will go back one more slide. This cycle on the bottom left without no high density core, so it does not qualify. In these cases, and I don't have it outlined explicitly in this this presentation because it's very recent work that I've conducted. We are considering merging those in if this distance, so this core that developed that did not have a high density center, if it's within a half of a mile of an urban area or core that has that high density center, and there is sufficient commuter flow using the loads data of at least 50% of the people that reside in this core are commuting over to this one, then we would allow it to merge back in. We would also do the same thing even if this has a primary core. If the commuter flow and the data really show that there is a close functional connection. So the results of all of that, this is just one kind of snapshot of kind of the changes. So on the left side, the 2020 Federal Register Notice proposed criteria, that's what went out. And as I had shown in those maps with all those many kind of scattershot little cycles or pieces, there were cases. So for example, Charlotte, North Carolina, it was comprised of over 515 individual pieces. With the first run of the test criteria, that was reduced down to 62 cycles. So you had an 88% reduction in the number of cycles. You increase the total area by about 10% and add a little bit in terms of population housing units. So in our mind, this was a success. We were reducing the number of cycles, making a cleaner output without really ballooning or expanding the urban areas too excessively. So this table here, it includes only a few of the urban areas for North Carolina and Tennessee. These were kind of case studies because this area is affected the most by that type of criteria. So what I showed earlier on with the density composition of urban areas for 2010, I reran it for everything that in our test delineation to kind of get an idea of what did it look like, and then the next 4 slides, I just sorted them in order according to the proportion of population in each urban area that resides within one of these 4 density classes. So this first slide, these are the urban areas that have the highest proportion of population in that very low, less than 213 housing unit density areas. Progressing through, this is the next classification, 213 to 427, 427 to 1280, and eventually 1280 and up. And what I'll point out here on this last one, you can see very quickly geographically where these types of urban areas are. Those with the highest density are almost exclusively on the West Coast in California, apart from a few which are limited by the natural landscape, physical features. In other words, a few of them are islands, right? So they're forced to have high densities. California is similar. They have a lot of zoning laws, and then also just the value of rural territory out there, which is agricultural, very valuable. So something that affects you, certainly in New Jersey and all of the country, though, and something that we have not changed since the proposed criteria is our splitting criteria. And so, as I had mentioned, we are transitioning from a more legacy approach, historical perspective of where areas, these large agglomerations should be broken or split apart. We're relying more on, or almost exclusively on, the LEHD loads data, this commuting flow data, to identify functional divides between portions of these large agglomerations. So this is just kind of a pretty slide here. This is just showing some examples of how these data are used in other research projects. The longitudinal employer household dynamics data, I highly recommend anyone who is interested in commuter flows, jobs data and such, to investigate these data. They're really wonderful. But essentially, for the purpose of the urban areas delineation, while the loads data is divided into types of work, even ages of the employees, we are considering all equal. It doesn't matter the age or the type of work. We're including all data. So I just wanted to make that clear. And I don't think it's on a slide coming up or not, but we're using the 3 most recent years of data. So this splitting process, there are 2 major steps. The first step, we look at an aggregate commuter flow between urban areas that were adjacent or were split basically in 2010. So you have 2 urban areas that are adjacent to each other. We're looking at the total amount of flow between the 2. And then if that flow is really high, and I think I have all of it here, but if it is greater than 50% in both directions, then that implies that there's too much functional connection and that split was arbitrary and that those urban areas should be 1. So that's kind of step 1, this aggregate view, deciding whether or not the split should even exist. If we see that there is not significant commuter flow between these adjacent urban areas, that there is some sort of a functional separation, then we would evaluate it still using those same data, but in a very different methodology, evaluate where to move the boundary. And the way that we're doing that is by using the Leiden community detection algorithm. This is an algorithm that takes all of these, the commuter data, so the home block and employer block, all these network data, and it creates communities that, if I can remember, I always get it backwards when I first try to describe it, but that you want to maximize the number of communities, but have the greatest amount of internal flow. You don't want to have flow between communities. I'll show examples of it later, but that's kind of the idea behind it. It creates these consistent communities that have very little inter-community flow. So two examples of step one, Phoenix, well, it's really Avondale, sorry, Avondale outside of Phoenix. Avondale and Phoenix are adjacent to each other. In 2010, they were split. But looking at the loads data, we can see that in terms of where do Avondale residents work, well, 83.5% of them are commuting over to Phoenix. Where do Avondale workers, so those employees that are working in Avondale, where are they coming from? 57% of them are coming from Phoenix. We feel that this type of functional connection is in excess of what we think should have a split implemented. And so in this case, Avondale would be merged. Well, not merged. It just would not be split away from Phoenix. Alternatively, we have Washington, D.C. Urban area, and we can see kind of the same type of data, much higher internal flow. So people that reside here, work here, people that work here, reside here. And I say here because that's where I am right now. But I hope that kind of makes sense. And so in this case, the splits surrounding Washington, D.C. would be, and really it's just the Washington-Baltimore, would be evaluated for where they could best be placed, but it would continue. And so that's, I have these manuscripts that are cited here. If you're really interested in it, I do recommend reading through those. They're a little technical, but really interesting work. The algorithm was developed in Belgium, where they are using it for their entire delineation, essentially, of urban areas. And so we are just using it for that, for adjusting where those split boundaries would occur. So here are two maps of the Washington, D.C. area, representing from low proportion to high proportion, red to blue, in terms of where do Washington residents work. So those in Washington are working primarily in the Washington, D.C. Urban area. Some of them you can see are working into the Baltimore urban area. This is the 2010 split. These are all 2010 boundaries. The kind of opposite perspective, where do Washington workers live? So you can see in this case, many of the people in this area, which is technically still a part of the Baltimore urban area, are working. So where do Washington workers live? So they're working in Washington, D.C., but they're residing here. And in this case, we've run, I don't have a map of it here, but we've run the Leiden community detection algorithm, and the boundary of the communities that are formed align very closely with these data, same data input. And so all we would do is adjust this split boundary to the north, better matching that functional flow. So that was a lot, I know, and I hope there's questions, and I hope I can answer them and clarify things. And I'll read through the chat as well to make sure I cover things. But this is the general schedule, what we have been following so far, and then where we're going. Our plan, the final criteria are right at the end. I have to kind of be a little bit cryptic when saying things, because it still needs to go through legal team review and such before it's published. The plan is to have the final criteria Federal Register notice published mid-February of 2022. And then the final actual qualifying urban areas in the summer of 22. And I have contact information. This is for the whole team. My email is in the beginning, but if you send in any message to this email, our whole team will receive it. The proposed criteria notice, and then the viewer. And again, this viewer is showing what criteria was described in this notice, which hopefully I've done an okay job of showing or describing how it was updated since then. But with that, please, any questions that you have while I read through the chat. Anyone? So I'll just read through the question out loud, since everyone's staring at me while I concentrate. Increasing the threshold from 2,500 or 5,000 for transportation purpose to 10,000 may reduce the urban area. Assume an urban area changes from urban area to rural area. How are we going to address the issue? Okay, I have the impression that we cannot change from urban to rural, but we can change from rural to urban if a road project. Okay. So yeah, I think, and so that was from Simon. I think you're referencing like the qualification for metropolitan planning organizations, possibly. Is that correct? I don't know if Simon's on right now. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And we have worked very closely. We've been sharing all of our kind of progress reports with the Department of Transportation. We have worked closely with them to let them know that these changes are coming, because this is really the largest change that's happened in quite a few decades in terms of urban areas. From our understanding, and this is a completely non-official response, so you would have to get it from them, but the understanding is that any metropolitan planning organization that exists now will not automatically be removed or unqualified if it no longer has an urban area that meets the minimum threshold. They have that kind of leniency to allow it to continue. I think in some cases it's up to the governor. They can actually choose to, if a metropolitan planning organization no longer qualifies, I think, and again, this is non-official, but I think that the governor can actually make that choice to remove it or keep it. But again, that's we while we definitely try to keep in mind the impacts on programmatic needs and other uses of urban areas, the approach that we take is to be as unbiased as possible and create a data-driven objective model. But again, we definitely keep those needs in mind and try to work closely so that we both understand the impacts. Yeah, okay, I guess I followed back down. Maybe that's what Keith was referencing. Yeah, a good one for FHWA, yeah. And then, oh, there's more. Okay, it was slide 36, New York City urban areas. Oh, let's see. Well, I don't even know what 36 is, but I think this probably. These are all 2010, if that's what the reference was.
There you go.
Awesome.
If anyone else has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself to ask Michael.
And thank you very much for listening and following along. I know a lot of this is really there's a lot of criteria. It's fairly complex. It's really fun. Well, it's been a great pleasure for everyone on the team to work on this, and we've really the presentations like this where there was engagement and questions and feedback coming in have been really priceless, truly valuable to this process. So I'm really grateful for all those opportunities.
Terrific. I have one request, Michael.
Yes.
If you could send me a copy of this presentation, I would appreciate that, because my intent is to send it out to everybody that attended the meeting. So
great. I will do that. Show the reduction in cycles. Yes, so the cycles, I know it's a kind of a weird name. I didn't even know about it until I started working on this program. Yeah, the cycles are those individual units. So like in this graph, each one of these like contiguous areas is a cycle. So this is one cycle, this is one, anywhere that it's fully contiguous. If I had maps of them. Of cycle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, and a cycle can be one block, or it can be, there's no limit on the number of blocks. Well, 8.5 million, and for 2020, I think that's how many blocks we have. And then I feel bad I didn't have their names on there, but I do want to really, give credit to the whole team as well. Usually Jennifer Zanoni and I do these presentations together, but she was busy today. So, but there's a whole team of us that are working really hard on this. What also is, I'm just filling time if that's all right, Len.
That's fine.
I know everyone's ready to go. This is the last presentation, but also one other thing that I think will be interesting for data users and researchers, demographers, is that everything that the whole delineation is being built in software that we're creating in our team. So my supervisor, Jeff Ocker, is writing all of the code. We hope, and this is absolutely not a promise at all, but our goal is to eventually be able to share that software so that data users can create their own delineations. And almost every criteria has parameters built into the software, so you could adjust it to create your own delineation. And all of the data that we are using is 100% public and freely available. And the software, everything that we're conducting is either open source software or is our publicly available data. So everything should be replicable. And like I say, I think that researchers could really enjoy playing with the tool once we build it and publish it. Again, not a promise. It could be years away. There's always a lot of red tape in producing something like that. Now I'll stop. For those that know me, I can talk forever. So. Well, thank you, Len.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for coming or for beaming in, so to speak, to give us this presentation and educate us on this topic. It's not one that we see regularly at our meeting, but the material that you presented is fascinating. I know our transportation folks were very interested in what you had to say.
Okay. Yeah, if anyone wants to reach out and discuss in more detail, I'm typically available just about any time. So feel free.
Very good. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for attending the first day. It's been a great first day. Tomorrow we will reconvene at 12:30. And again, the link that was sent out for today's meeting is still good for tomorrow. We'll start